The champion had spent 20 years learning how to move men who did not want to be moved, and the smallest problem he had ever faced was sitting in the next chair with his ankle crossed over his knee, declining to stand up. That was the whole confrontation in the end. Not a punch, not a throw. A very large man who had built his entire life on forcing people to go where he wanted them to go, standing over a small man who simply would not be sent anywhere. It was a late-night talk show, taped in the early 1970s in a studio in Burbank, that looked enormous on television and was cramped and cold in person. Blue curtains, a painted skyline, a desk the host worked from the way a captain works a wheel. 200 people in the audience, close enough to be part of the show and far enough to think they understood it. The host had been doing this longer than anyone alive, and he could feel the temperature of a room change through the soles of his shoes. There were 2 guests in the chairs beside the desk that night. The one nearest the host was a lean, watchful actor with a wide, easy smile and eyes that never stopped working. A man who had done enough of his own stunts to know exactly how rare real physical genius was, and who had brought his friend on the show partly as a favor and partly because he wanted the country to see him. His friend sat in the far chair, a small man in a black mandarin collared jacket, still and comfortable, watching everything. And filling the center of the stage, because there was no chair in the building that would hold him, stood the other guest, a sumo grand champion, close to 400 pounds, arranged with a density that television could not convey, his hair in the oiled top knot of his rank, a dark ceremonial belt wound around his waist. He was, by any measure that his sport recognized, one of the greatest living practitioners of the oldest organized combat art on earth. He had come to America as a goodwill ambassador, to be looked at and admired, and for the first 20 minutes of the segment that is exactly what happened. If you want to understand how an evening of goodwill turned into the quietest confrontation ever taped in that studio, stay with this, because it did not turn on an insult. It turned on a single word that got lost in translation, and on the fact that the small man in the black jacket understood the champion's art better than the champion expected anyone in that room to understand it. The host asked good questions through an interpreter. What was the training like? How does a man become that size on purpose? Is it strength, or is it something else? And the champion answered with the ease of a man who has answered them 100 times, that it was not fat, the way Americans thought, that underneath was the strongest set of legs in professional sport, that the whole art lived below the waist, in the feet, in the hips, in the center of a man's weight. He said a thing the interpreter rendered a little stiffly, that in his sport you did not defeat a man by hitting him, you defeated him by taking his balance. Once a man's center is yours, he said, the rest of him follows. He is already falling, he simply has not been told yet. The small man in the black jacket, who had said almost nothing for 20 minutes, nodded slowly at that. It was a small movement, but he nodded like a man agreeing with something true, not like a man being polite, and the champion saw it, and something about being agreed with by a man a quarter of his size landed on him the wrong way. The host, sensing a current, turned to the small man and asked whether he, as a fighter himself, had a view, and the small man said, mildly, that he thought the champion was exactly right. That balance was everything, that most people believed a fight was about the hands, when the hands were only the last thing to arrive. He said the champion understood something that took most martial artists a lifetime to learn, if they learned it at all, that you do not have to overpower a man if you understand where his weight is. It was a compliment. It was a real one. But it had a second edge that the champion heard and the audience did not, because the small man had said it the way one expert acknowledges another, as a peer, and the champion had not come on American television to be met as a peer by a man who weighed 135 pounds. He came to be the largest thing in the room, and he had just been quietly told, in front of 200 people, that the small man already knew the secret at the center of his art. He said something to the interpreter, and the interpreter hesitated, and the host, who had learned to watch for exactly that hesitation, leaned forward. The champion said it again, more directly, and this time he did not wait for the translation. He rose from the reinforced bench they had built for him, and he crossed the 2 steps to the small man's chair, and he looked down at him from a great height and said, in effortful but perfectly clear English, one word, "Stand." The audience made a sound. The host started to come up out of his chair. The actor in the next seat went very still, and the people who knew him said afterward that he did not look worried. He looked interested, the way a man looks when he already knows how something ends and wants to watch it happen anyway. And here is the part worth staying for, because the small man's answer to being ordered to his feet by a 400-pound grand champion was to stay exactly where he was. He did not stand, he did not tense, he looked up, unhurried, and he crossed one ankle a little more comfortably over his knee, and he folded his hands in his lap, and he said quietly, so the champion had to stop his own breathing to hear it, "No." Then he said, "You told us something a minute ago. You said you do not defeat a man by hitting him. You defeat him by taking his balance." And the champion, standing over him, said, "Yes, that is true." And the small man said, "Then take mine. I am sitting down. My balance is already low, already yours for the taking. You are the greatest in the world at this. Take it." The studio went quiet in a way that studios almost never do, because 200 people had just understood, a beat behind the 2 men, that the small man had not refused the challenge. He had accepted it, on the champion's own terms, from a chair. The champion reached down and took a fistful of the black jacket at the shoulder, not the throat, the shoulder, a grip meant to lift and turn, the grip of a man who moves other men for a living, and he pulled, the specific rolling pull that had put 400-pound opponents onto the clay in front of packed arenas. The small man came forward out of the chair, perhaps 4 inches, and then something happened that the champion felt long before the audience saw it. The small man did not resist the pull. He went with it, but he went with it in a direction fractionally different from the one the champion had chosen, his weight sliding down and forward, under the grip instead of against it, so that the enormous force the champion had committed met nothing where it expected to meet resistance. The champion had pulled a man expecting the man to pull back. The man had not pulled back, and a huge force aimed at a spot where the resistance suddenly is not there, does not disappear. It has to go somewhere. It went into the champion. For one instant, and the front 3 rows saw it, and the actor in the next chair saw it, and the champion above all felt it. The grand champion's own weight came up over the balls of his feet. Not a fall, not close to a fall, but a shift, a half-inch migration of 400 pounds past the edge of where a man that size keeps his center, the exact error he had spent 20 years teaching other men to make and never making himself. His free hand came off his hip on reflex, out and down, to catch a balance that had begun, very slightly, to leave him. And the small man, still half in the chair, still holding nothing, simply stopped moving. He let his weight settle back down, and the champion's grip, which had been trying to lift a man, was now attached to a man who had become an anchor, and the champion understood in that half-second the thing that took the audience another few beats to understand, that the small man had just done to him, gently from a sitting position, the exact thing the champion had described as the whole point of his art. He had taken the champion's balance, and then he had given it back. The champion let go of the jacket. He straightened up slowly. He looked at his own hand, and then he looked down at the small man, who was settling his collar with 2 fingers, and who had never once been in danger, and had never once tried to harm him. and the audience did not know what to do because there had been no throw and no strike, and nobody had fallen, and yet everyone in the first several rows had the distinct sense that they had just watched the largest man in the building lose something. The small man spoke again, and now his voice was not an answer to a challenge, it was one craftsman to another. He said, "You are the strongest man I have ever sat next to. Everything you said tonight was true." He said, "I did not do that to embarrass you. I did it because you are the only man in this room who would understand what I did. Everyone else thinks I refused to stand. You know that I answered you." And the interpreter, catching up, said the last part in Japanese, and the champion's face changed as he heard his own art described back to him from a chair. For a long moment, the grand champion looked at the small man. Then he did something no one in that studio was prepared for. He stepped back, and he brought his feet together, and he lowered himself, all 400 pounds of him, slowly with the perfect control of a man whose whole body is under his command, into a formal bow, the deep bow his sport reserves for a master. He held it. 200 Americans who did not know what they were looking at watched the most dominant sumo champion of his era bow to a man in a chair, and some instinct told them it was enormous, even though they could not have said why. The small man returned it from his seat, a bow of the head, grave and unhurried. The host, who had been standing behind his desk this entire time with one hand still half raised, sat back down. He looked at the camera. He had built a career on always having the next line, and for 4 full seconds he did not use it, which for that host was the most eloquent thing he could possibly have done. Then he said, quietly, that he had been hosting this program for a very long time, and that he did not fully understand what he had just seen, but that he knew it was the best thing that had ever happened on his stage. And the audience, released, came apart into applause that was equal parts relief and awe, because a room will always applaud a thing it can feel is important, even when it cannot explain it. The champion went back to his reinforced bench, but he sat differently now, turned a few degrees toward the small man, and for the rest of the segment he watched him the way you watch someone you have decided you are not finished learning from. Afterward, in the corridor behind the studio, with the cameras off and the interpreter gone home, the champion and the small man passed each other one more time. There was no one to translate. The champion stopped, and he searched for the English, and what he found was 2 words. He said, "Thank you," and the small man understood everything that was inside them and inclined his head, and neither of them ever spoke about it publicly again. Years later, the people who had been in that studio would argue about the details, the way they always do, whether the champion's foot had really come up or whether the light had played a trick, how far the small man had come out of the chair, what was said at the very end, but everyone who was close enough agreed on the shape of it, and the shape was this: the most powerful man any of them had ever seen ordered a small man to stand and fight. And the small man, without rising, without striking, without raising his voice, took the one thing the champion had spent his whole life learning to take from others, and then, because he had never wanted it, handed it politely back.